Last week, the monster was convicted at Liverpool Crown Court and given a life sentence with a 52-year tariff. I won't picture the monster, nor will I mention his name. Other pundits, including news anchors, have adopted that position. It's been suggested that he could be paroled one day, let out of jail before his tariff is ended. That doesn't sound plausible at the moment, but somebody said 40 years from now there could be people sitting on a parole board, people who are not yet born, who will have his future in their hands. That's if he lives that long, if he isn't murdered in prison. I'd like to comment on not that specifically, but on other cases which are, at least one of them is as dreadful, or nearly as dreadful, and give this some perspective. Please excuse this creaking desk as usual. The Socialist Workers' Party website. These people never cease to amaze me. They said a British teenager who had become obsessed with mass violence. That's what they called him, a British teenager. Others have called him a Welsh choir boy. And they say the far right have exploited the Southport attacks to their advantage. Really? These people have been exploiting the murder of Stephen Lawrence for over 3 decades. And don't let's mention the death of George Floyd on the other side of the Atlantic. They have disbelief, contempt. Before mentioning the other cases, I'll give this some perspective. There's been a lot of hysteria, verging on hysteria, about two things. One is the refusal of those in authority to allude this as a terrorist case, and also the secrecy around it, which has been called a cover-up. Now, there was some element of cover-up. The secrecy, I mean, the police were not open initially about about who was responsible and their investigation. I have some little sympathy for them here because, I mean, this isn't the United States. Police in this country keep things very much under wraps. And also, there was an ongoing investigation. I mean, who knows that? How can we have been certain that he was acting alone? There's talk about him being radicalised. Was he radicalised by some lunatic Islamist online or what? We don't know. And they found rice under his bed, so who's to say that they couldn't have found it? There could have been rice or weapons or something elsewhere. So I have some sympathy for them. As for it not being classified as terror, well, terror is generally recognised as being for a political end. Destruction of property, attacks on people with the aim of promoting a political end, be it regime change or whatever, climate change, whatever. From what I've seen about this guy, from what has now been released about him, let's talk about him going to mosque in prison and being a Muslim, but he's no more Muslim than most of these nutters who so-called white supremacists and Nazis. They pick up a sort of Hollywood association of evil with the swastika, and they call themselves Nazis. They don't think about it. And this guy, a lot of these Islamists, they don't understand Islam, and the terrorists, the converts, they just, I mean, it's just you can't really call them a lot of the time Muslims, and here he was quite clearly obsessed with with death. He wanted to carry out a genocide on the white population, but I suppose you could call him racist. But it's just an obsession with death, and I've no doubt that if he'd have been more covert about this, he would have, if he'd have used the ricin first, God forbid, he would have targeted people irrespective of race, or maybe he couldn't care less if he killed blacks and Asians or whatever as well. It's really, I mean, this is sick, but we've seen sick people like this before. The nearest I can think to compare him with are the Columbine shooters, the Columbine High, those two kids who went on a rampage there. We see, it's just evil. Evil. Now, as to him being released at some point, let me give you details about some other people who have been convicted of heinous crimes. We start with Harry Roberts. I remember this, not well, but it was about 10 days after my 10th birthday in 1966, the Braybrook Street Massacre. Harry Roberts was a former soldier turned career criminal. He and two other criminals were in a car, and they were stopped by three police officers in plain clothes in another car, and they ended up murdering all three of them. Roberts killed two of them, shot two of them. The other passenger in the car killed the third, and all three were convicted of murder. Well, the driver, of course, all three were convicted of murder. The co-defendants of Harry Roberts were John Duddy, who was the other guy who with the gun. Bang. He died in prison in 1981. The driver was a man named John Whitney, who served 25 years or so. He was actually murdered by a drug addict on August 15th, 1999. He was 69 years old. Roberts is the most notorious. The left have a little ditty about him. Harry Roberts is our friend, is our friend, is our friend. Harry Roberts is our friend, he kills coppers. He was actually paroled some time ago, obviously against the wishes of the police and of the public. He's now well into his 80s. He's expressed regret. Well, he would have to express some regret, otherwise he wouldn't have been paroled, but he has expressed regret after being released. So that was three police officers murdered and the guy paroled. Next we come to 1973. This is a case which is almost as horrible as that horrible business in Southport. Some would say even worse. If you're an American especially, you may think that Friday the 13th is a horror film franchise. There was actually a real Friday the 13th. It was April the 13th, 1973. Friday the 13th of April 1973. And the Michael Myers of this atrocity was a guy named David McGreavy. McGreavy was the son of a Navy veteran. He followed his father into the Navy and was kicked out. Let's just say he was a bad egg, and he had a drink problem. He had a friend named Ralph, that was his surname, Ralph, who was a married man with they had three kids, him and his wife. And Ralph invited McGreavy into his home, put him up, and he babysit for a bit. Mr. Ralph's wife, Elsie, was a barmaid. She worked at a bar part-time as a barmaid. One night she left McGreavy to babysit. The baby was 8 months old. There was a 2-year-old girl named Dawn and a 4-year-old boy named Paul. The baby's crying upset McGreavy, if that's the word. And he murdered all three kids. He murdered all three of them. He fractured the baby's skull, slit the throat of the girl, the 2-year-old girl, and strangled the 4-year-old boy. Then he went down to the basement and with a pickaxe mutilated the bodies. And then he impaled all three on the spikes of a wrought iron fence in a neighbour's yard. This is like horror of horror of horror. There was quite a lot of publicity at the time. I was born in 1956, so do the math. I was a teen, but I may remember it vaguely. It obviously had some publicity, but McGreavy pleaded guilty, so it wasn't a massive trial, and of course there was no internet or social media like nowadays. He pleaded guilty, and this was in Worcester. He's known as the Monster of Worcester. And the judge gave him the life sentence with a 20-year tariff. He probably gave him such a short tariff because he couldn't imagine his wildest dreams that McGreavy would ever be paroled. Well, there was an attempt to parole him. In 2006, he was photographed walking the streets of Merseyside. What happens with life sentence prisoners are paroled is, in this country, they're moved to an open prison and then they're given day release to a bail hostel or whatever, somebody in the prison service or the Home Office tipped off the Daily Mail, and McGreavy was photographed walking the streets of Merseyside. And he was recalled to prison, or he didn't get the parole, but in 2019 he was actually paroled. This was a man who committed absolutely unspeakable crimes. I was going to do these in order, then I thought, will I do this? Yeah, I will. Mary Bell. Mary Bell was an 11-year-old girl who murdered two young boys. She was convicted of manslaughter in 1968 and was paroled in 1980 with lifelong anonymity. The details of the case you'll find all over the internet. And let me put it this way, she was clearly a psychopath. She tried to blame someone else for the murders. It should be murder, but manslaughter. 11 years old is, younger than that is very dodgy. Two 10-year-olds, Thompson and Venables, they were convicted when they were 11, but they were 10 when they murdered James Bolger in 1993. But Mary Bell is just like almost Donny Incapax, just around the age of no criminal responsibility. But they locked her up for around 12 years, and she was given lifelong anonymity. And she's had at least one baby. She's presumably a married woman now. Colin Pitchfork. This is a terrible one. Colin Pitchfork has a unique place in history because he was the first murderer to be caught by DNA profiling. The facts of this case are very well documented. He murdered two 15-year-old girls around 3 years apart, and he allowed a none too bright youth to be charged with the second murder. Richard Buckland was 17 years old. He was hanging about when the second body was found. He was hanging around the crime scene, and the police thought that was odd, and they arrested him. And he ended up confessing to it, and they charged him with murder. Then Alec Jeffreys came up with DNA profiling, and they had, I'll put this diplomatically, and they had DNA evidence of both bodies, and Buckland insisted he didn't know anything about the first murder. He'd only been about 14 or 15 then. Colin Pitchfork allowed this kid to take the rap. Alec Jeffreys was brought in, and he said that the DNA from basically the same person murdered both girls. Pitchfork was arrested in September 1987. He committed other crimes as well. He attacked at least 2 other girls, not sexually, but it could have been worse. And he was a really horrible human being. He was a married man as well. Women do marry men like this, which probably explains why I'm single. He was given a tariff of, I think, something like 29 years. You'll find the details on the internet, including Bailey, the British and Irish Legal Information Institute. He was granted parole. He was allowed out. He was moved to an open prison. Then there was photographed by, he was sitting on a bench or something eating lunch. Somebody must have tipped off the press. Then he was paroled. Paroled in 2021, but was soon recalled to prison. It was, he was paroled under very strict terms, but I mean, there was complaints about him going for long walks, but it may have been that the withdrawal was unwarranted, but he should never be. It may be that he didn't break the terms of his parole, but he should never have been paroled. I mean, in the United States, a guy like this he would never see daylight again. In some jurisdictions, he would be a candidate for execution, although it would take years or decades to execute. The men have been on death row for 20, 30 plus years. It's ridiculous. So anyway, these are, I don't know if you call Harry Roberts a monster. It's certainly a nasty piece of work, and anyone who's responsible for 3 murders like that, I mean, you don't want them around. Those are the worst cases. There have been others. When the so-called peace process went into action in Northern Ireland, some quite horrible people were paroled or let out of prison. One is Michael Stone, not to be confused with Britain's longest serving miscarriage of justice prisoner, Michael Stone. I'll put a link to the Michael Stone websites, plural, below. This guy murdered 6 people, and he was caught on camera shooting people in a I think it was a funeral in a cemetery. You can look it up. I mean, this is all. If you live in the UK, and if you're nearly as ancient as me, and especially if you're a crime buff, you'll know about most of these cases. So, will the monster ever be paroled? Well, I sincerely hope not. I will lose no sleep if he's murdered in prison. He's certainly going to have a rough ride. He'll be kept in solitary confinement. There's been talk about them trying to have him nutted off, sent to a psychiatric hospital, one of the so-called special hospitals. Broadmoor is the most notorious, but there are, I think it's 2 others. I just hope he's never released. This is so horrible, and the reaction of the extreme left to it. It's the Socialist Workers' Party. They didn't mention the massacre until the so-called far right local people started rioting, albeit under a misapprehension. But it's absolutely terrible. I hope it's never released. Those are my thoughts on the case. And if you're still on this planet 40 years from now, I certainly won't be. I'll be around for another 5 years at this rate. But if you're still on this planet 40 years from now, 50 years from now, hopefully you will remember this case. As there's any talk of this monster being released, you'll make your opinion known.